so many new pieces to this IU football team.
To me, that's going to set the tone on how you get ready for games on Saturday in the fall.
I would put that Indiana room up against anybody else in the conference, and that's something that we typically don't even come close to saying.
If you want to get total sickos committee about it, there's a position battle at long snapper too.
This is the Hoosier Huddle Podcast, part of the College Huddle Podcast Network.
Good morning and welcome to the Hoosier Huddle Podcast. I'm Sammy Jacobs. Along with me is T.J. Inman. I apologize for not having a podcast last week. My little one had an ear infection. No daycare help, and just couldn't fit it in with our schedule. So there's nothing wrong with everybody's podcast feeds. We did not do a podcast last week, but we did all our preview stuff on the site and things like that. So we'll break down the win over Michigan, and then we'll look at some of the playoff scenarios that could come out tonight. The playoff rankings drop around 8:30. I believe it's at halftime of some of these action games that start at 7. So yeah, I wish they came out at 7, but we'll have to stay up till the late hours of 8:30 p.m. But TJ, welcome in. How are you doing?
Doing great. Yeah, certainly a show we've never done before, obviously, talking about a 10-0 Indiana team with a late bye week here before one of the games of the year in college football, with Indiana at Ohio State, very likely, barring a gigantic upset this weekend for Ohio State against Northwestern. It's at minimum a top 10 matchup, and very likely a top 5 matchup. It's been an awesome season, and ready to get talking about that Michigan game. It's not often we get to talk about IU beating Michigan.
Yeah, it's only happened 11 times. The last time it happened was 2020, and not many people were in the stadium to see it.
Right.
I'll take a humble brag and say I was there, but I was one of maybe a couple hundred in the stadium that day. But yeah, I thought it was another gutty win. Eventually Indiana, you're not going to play your A+ game 100% of the time. It's just not going to happen. And you saw that in the second half on offense. The defense played their A+ game the entire game. So did, what? Special teams did not give their A+ game. James Evans, punting kind of moves them to an A-, maybe a B+. But the offense didn't play well. And I think what went under the radar to Drew Evans, it was announced before the game, starting left guard Drew Evans was lost for the season with an Achilles injury that he suffered in practice. Tyler Stevens comes in, holds his own, against 2 defensive tackles who will be playing on Sundays in the near future. But man, what a game. It was the first time he kind of felt nervous all year about it. But you had CBS in town. If you haven't watched the broadcast, I go back and watch it. It's an A+ broadcast. The shots of Memorial Stadium from the drone and things like that were awesome. The towels, so kudos to the athletic department for doing the towels for at the stadium. They look great. I think that's, you start winning games, you start building traditions. That could be one of the traditions now is towels at games and stuff like that. But let's get down to the game, TJ. Indiana squeaks one down, 20-15. They jump out to a 17-3 lead. At halftime, they come out. You stop Michigan on their first drive. They punt, gets down to, I think, inside the 5. Curtis Rourke, first pass, interception at the 6. Defense holds them to a field goal, which would probably save the game right there. A touchdown there, and, you kind of feel the air get out of the balloon. But, Let's start with the second half. What went wrong offensively for IU?
I think it was the first time that we've seen Indiana's offensive line get knocked back. Um, and that happened. Michigan did a couple of different things. Number one, you mentioned it, they've got a pair of really good interior defensive linemen. Um, Sometimes you have to give credit to the opponent and, kind of tip your cap and say those guys are really good. Um, and they've got a pair of those that, you said they'll be playing on Sundays. At least one of them, Graham, is probably a first round draft pick. I haven't done a lot of looking at mock drafts, but regardless, they're really good collegiate players, and they'll probably be really good pro players too, starting next season. Um, so you have to give them credit for that. But I thought they did some interesting things with interior blitzes. Um, I think the first half, Indiana did not have any problems with what Wink Martindale was doing on defense. They made some adjustments and were really forcing the interior of IU's offensive line and Indiana's running backs to do a lot of blocking. And it was causing a couple of issues. The second thing that I think went wrong for the offense is something that we saw against Michigan State early in that game as well, and that was just that they barely had the ball.
Yeah,
Um, the third quarter, Michigan has time. I think it was 13-20 or 13-22, something like that. More than
yeah,
13 minutes time of possession for the Wolverines in that third quarter. You mentioned that interception. That's a big part of it. That's Michigan goes on a not a successful drive, but they at least ran a lot of clock and moved the ball into IU territory before having to punt. Um, they punt, pin Indiana back, and then IU gives them the ball right back, and they churn another, minute and 30, 2 minutes off the clock before having to kick a field goal. So time of possession was a big issue, especially in the third quarter. That makes it hard for your offense to get into a rhythm. And then, just a pair of uncharacteristic drops. Drop feels like a harsh term for that second one. Surratt, back shoulder throw that him and Curtis Rourke have really done really incredibly well all season. Rourke again put it right where it needed to be. Surratt, stops, jumps, makes the play. It just could not complete the catch as he hit the ground inside of the 5 yard line. If he makes either of those catches, it's probably a different story, and just a little bit more of a comfortable win. So you take those
yeah.
issues
And then
out,
the
those
the
two drops. I mean but I think the big thing was that the offensive line got pushed back, um, and had some problems in a way that we haven't seen so far before. Uh, the bye week comes at a good time to try and see what it was that Michigan did, because that's something Ohio State was watching as well.
yeah, it was, people are going to say Michigan's 5-5. They weren't. They aren't what they were last year, and their offense is terrible. It's not good. Davis Warren overthrew. Their defense is really good though, and that's what we'll see when the playoff rankings come out. Well, Indiana hasn't beaten the team with the well Michigan. Everybody thought Michigan was a top 10 team coming into the season. And then, they knew that they had quarterback problems and problems on offense, but they gave them the benefit of the doubt because they wear that winged helmet. Um, but the defense was legit and, Indiana won. So you moved to 10-0. I thought there were some other things that kept that game close. There was a offensive pass interference on a play where Miles Price makes a catch and then gets knocked out of the game. That would have put him inside, I think inside the five, maybe
Yeah, it
definitely
was.
inside the 10, but inside the five. And then again, if Surratt makes that catch, he's down at the 1 or 2 yard line. You punch that in. Now you're looking at 34 to 15 or 34. You're looking into the 30s, and the offense looks much better. But kudos to Niko Radicic. He
Yeah.
finally got those pressure calls. 40-yard field goal, I think, right before halftime. That helps
Yep.
make that 17-3. And then the huge and the icing on the cake, that 42-yard field goal after the punt return from Keyshawn Williams, so we'll talk about here in a second.
Yeah.
Um, really, really put the game out of reach. You didn't think Michigan would go down and score a touchdown because they did it once all day, but I think that drive started at the 36 or
Yes.
something after a bad punt. So, you felt pretty comfortable after that. And it was just one of those games where I won't say happy to or lucky to win, but one of those games during the season that you're going to have. And, Indiana found themselves on the right side of it. How many times in the past have we seen Indiana's out to a big lead against Michigan? Here comes Michigan. All of a sudden it's 17-17. Air goes out of the stadium, which did not do this time. And, IU held on. They made the play on defense. Amari Farrell probably should have intercepted that 2-point play. Went right through his hands, but it was an incomplete pass anyway. So, 10-0 is 10-0. We'll see. And I'll write about it this week. IU's got to control what they can control. And right now, it's what you do against Ohio State and Purdue. If people want to pick apart your schedule, whatever. If they don't, if they want to give Alabama and Tennessee credit for losing games because they were perceived good losses, even though pretty sure Vanderbilt was picked 18th in the SEC. Them or Arkansas. But, it is what it is. And this is what I hate about the 12-team playoff too. Yeah, I'm excited Indiana's in it, but it's also, it's a money grab from people in power, and they're going to want to put the brand names in there. So, and it should not take away from an unbelievable Indiana football season. So, any final
Right.
thoughts? Or let's get to Keyshawn Williams. Miles Price
Yeah.
gets knocked out of the game. Keyshawn Williams is Indiana's leading receiver, 6 catches, 70 yards. Had a fantastic catch on the sideline early in the game
Yeah.
on the drive that ended in an Omar Cooper touchdown. And then I thought the biggest play of the game was that punt return, 22-yard punt return, kind of flips the field on Michigan. It was a short punt. You get it inside the 38. The offense does just enough to get it within field goal range, and you put that game out of reach. But having a guy like Keyshawn Williams in reserve on a team where depth is kind of becoming a concern now with all the
Yeah.
departures and then some injuries, it was nice to see him step up. What were your thoughts on Keyshawn?
He's been great all season. Really early in the year, he was kind of a red zone playmaker that IU was finding mismatches as a slot receiver on slant routes into the end zone. Um, and it was kind of, man, he's not getting a lot of looks, but every time he does, he makes a play. And his usage has been going up as time has gone on. Um, I I think that you mentioned the injury part, and we don't, IU's not going to tell us anything, and that's fine. Um, Justice Ellison came back into the game, but clearly I think was a little limited after he left early. A clean hit, but still, I'm sure it was a really tough one, right to the midsection, and then his head slammed onto the turf hard. Um, so he was able to come back into the game later on, but did not do much the rest of the way. Um, Second was Miles Price. Again, probably a clean hit, but really hard one. Um, and Price was signaling to the fans that he was fine, but
Never
he did
returned.
not come back in. Um, Obviously, Justin Ellison and Miles Price are big pieces of your offense that we're gonna hopefully know their status before the Ohio State game, but we'll see. Um, I did want to mention the defensive performance that just the numbers on that. Um, I- they did a fantastic job on Colson Loveland. He was only able to get 4 catches for 37 yards, which is fine, but that's not what they need from him to Michigan. That's not what they need from him for their offense to work, because he is one of their few threats. He gets a lot of targets, and IU did a great job on him. And then running wise, 34 carries for 69 yards. That's only 2 yards a carry. And for a team that, prides itself on being bullies up front, uh, neither offensive line was really able to control this game at all. The defensive line won on both sides, especially in the second half. IU's offense got their work done in the first half and then did just enough. But um, credit to the defense. I think it does need to be, a little bit more acknowledged how balanced this team actually is. It's not just a fireworks show on offense. They can do that, but the defense won this game. The special teams helped win this game, and that's really important for a team that is going to go on a run like IU hopes to and has already. It's got to come from every facet of the game.
Yep.
And Indiana has shown that they are a complete team.
Yeah, it's you saw what happens when all three phases click against Nebraska. It ends up being a 56-7 blowout. And then Saturday is when you needed your defense and your special teams to step up, and they did. And we've seen the games where the offense had picked up the defense, like in against Maryland and games like that. So let's talk college football playoff.
Yep.
The rankings come out tonight around 8:30. In the initial rankings, IU was ranked 8th, but seeded 9th. And I know a lot of our readers were mad at me for saying they were seeded 9th instead of just ranked 8th. But to me, the ranking is irrelevant right now. It's where you're seated that's important,
Yep.
and things like that. What are your initial thoughts on where IU could land today?
Well, so Georgia lost their second defeat, and I think it's fair to point out they've had a couple other performances that I think should be scrutinized, and they're not because of the brand name of Georgia. But they had a couple other close calls that very easily could have been a third loss. But you know, their record is what it is, and they have 2 losses now. They should drop down.
They dropped 9
Beyond,
spots in the AP poll from
correct,
2 to 11.
correct. So from there, your what happens with BYU rankings wise? They were right there with Indiana. They're not going to pass Indiana um, based on them really escaping Utah with a win. But as you mentioned, that does not change Indiana's seed. Miami losing, that'll change the ranking, will not change the seed because of those auto bids. That's the current system. So that's the rules you got to play by. I think Texas moves up into um, into that number 3 spot, would be my assumption. Um, I do think that Indiana will make. I think IU will be ranked 6th in tonight's rankings, um, and I think that will keep their seed. I would say that their seed bumps up 1 to number 8. Um, right. I
So
guess
you
they'd
have
be number 7. They'd be 7.
so
Indiana would
you'd
be
have
seeded 7th. Yeah.
Oregon would be the top seed, Texas the 2 seed,
I
Was
would
it
say BYU is the 3 seed and Miami's the 4.
4? Then Ohio State drops to 5. They have Penn State, who I have an issue with at 4, ahead of IU. Would be the 6th. Tennessee, the 7th,
I think
and then
I think
IU,
it'll
the 8th.
be I think it'll be Indiana 7, Tennessee 8.
Okay. And then I don't know, Notre Dame's in there. They have the worst loss of the bunch to
Yes.
NIU. Their schedule, great. They beat Texas A&M. Texas A&M's 7-2. They beat Louisville, who's 6-3, who's barely a top 25 team. Uh, but at some point, I think losses have to matter. And that loss to NIU at home, in a game where NIU controlled most of the game, that that's got to count for something. And I know I
Yeah.
get it; it's Notre Dame, and you have all the brand recognition and too. But at some point, the regular season has to matter, and losing games has to matter. Otherwise, just put Oregon and Ohio State in the championship game, because they're clearly the two best teams, and you don't even need to deal with this playoff stuff. But
Well,
yeah,
so if we project forward, really what if things follow form, which they don't, it's college football, they're not going to follow form. It's not going to follow what's expected. But Indiana projected right now, the last that I saw was 9.5 point underdog at Ohio State. For hypothetical purposes, let's say that Indiana is competitive at Ohio State and loses 34-24 to Ohio State, loses
I
by
think
10.
that they should jump Penn State.
Okay. So if that occurs, the big question that everyone's asking is, does 11-1 Indiana make the college football playoff? There was consensus agreement that 10-2 Indiana does not make the college football playoff, but if Indiana loses to Ohio State, beats Purdue, and is competitive against Ohio State, that leaves Indiana at 11-1 with a competitive loss on Ohio State's home field. So in that scenario, you're comparing IU to Penn State, who would have the 11-1, very similar win profile, minus being as dominant as IU was in their wins. Okay. You would have the same loss, but Penn State would have lost at home to Ohio State in a competitive game, but at home. So you're comparing those two. You're comparing IU to Notre Dame, which, if things follow form, would be 11-1 with a little bit better wins. I think that's fair to say.
But a
Uh,
totally worse
but
loss.
but a completely, you know, by magnitudes worse loss. So you're comparing them, and then the big one to determine where IU lands and whether or not they make that field is going to be IU versus that group of two loss SEC teams.
Yeah, I mean, look,
Currently,
Alabama
uh,
Alabama got dominated by Vanderbilt, and they did. It was a 5 point loss at
yes,
the end, but they scored a touchdown with 2:46 left. Vanderbilt held the ball for 42 minutes. They had 418 total yards, 26 first downs. They dominated. Now the game against Tennessee, at Tennessee, that was a loss, 24-17 for Alabama, was much more competitive. You go to Ole Miss, who's the other two-loss SEC team. You lose at home against Kentucky, who is not good.
3-6
Yeah,
currently.
three, like a bad Kentucky team. Never really did it much in the second half. Um, Kentucky scores with 2 minutes left to win that game. You look at their other loss is against LSU in overtime, a 3 point loss at LSU. LSU, look, if you're going to say the Big Ten stinks, and LSU lost to USC,
There you go.
and USC's under 500. LSU also has losses to a blowout loss at Texas A&M, and they got
Alabama.
shellacked by Alabama at home.
Which is kind of the issue that you're going to run into if you're the selection committee, and you do have to have a bit of um,
Well, it all goes
sympathy is
back
not the right word, but
it
understanding,
all
right?
yeah, it all goes back to who people thought were going to be good in the preseason. Well, we thought LSU was going to be awesome, and we thought that Alabama was going to be, not miss a step, and we thought that Ole Miss would be fantastic, and all that stuff. Alabama should have lost to South Carolina. It's just like you got
Well,
to get this preseason bias out of here.
so I think that what you run into if you're the selection committee is going to be a lot of
LSU struggled to beat UCLA at home.
yes, yeah, and eliminating LSU with that third loss, but I think you're going to run into a lot of okay, Alabama beat Georgia, but Alabama lost to Tennessee, but Georgia beat Tennessee if Georgia does this weekend. So you're going to have a lot of that where it's transitive property stuff that gets you wound into a ball. Um,
Yeah, well then because Tennessee is so awesome, and Mississippi a 10-point win over Mississippi State, who's 0-6 in the Big or in the
yeah.
SEC and 2-8. You beat Kentucky by one, who's 3-6. You handle Auburn at home, who's 3-6, and the fighting Philip Bleedies, who didn't want to stay at Indiana. And then they get Northeast Power, Massachusetts after.
Well,
I mean,
and a point that I haven't heard made terribly often.
the
Um,
SEC
they
plays
play
eight
eight
conference
conference games.
games.
Yeah,
Eight
they play eight
conference
conference games.
games.
So they're playing UMass instead of Northwestern. Okay, it's we don't need to say, oh well, they're playing UMass instead of Ohio State.
No, it's
Okay, that's a
UMass
bit
instead of
disingenuous, but
I don't know, who is the worst team? UMass instead of Maryland?
Maryland, Northwestern, yeah, somebody, or Purdue, if we're being honest. Um,
Yeah,
but
sure. I
I,
forgot about Purdue, but yeah,
easy to
Purdue.
do. Um, I think that I have landed on if Indiana is competitive at Ohio State, I do feel confident that they would be placed into the bracket comfortably.
Yep.
It would not be as like the 11 seed. If Indiana gets beaten handily by Ohio State, now what does
What's
that mean?
handily? Yeah.
Exactly. What does it
What
mean?
is hand?
It's incredibly subjective. In my opinion, it would be uh something above 21 points. I would say if it's above 21 points. Now, what happens if Indiana trails by uh, 10 points and it's in the fourth quarter and then Ohio State scores a pair of touchdowns in the final 5 minutes
Well,
that
this
makes
is
it
where you need
24?
to. This
I
is
don't
where you
know.
need people to who watch games, not
Exactly.
just look at the box score,
Yeah.
which I don't know if this committee does or doesn't do or whatever. But you have a lot of national people who also just box score watch. You gotta
Yeah.
you gotta
Yeah.
watch games.
Yeah.
But yeah, I think at 11-1, if Indiana, let's just say they cover the 9.5 point spread. And if you lose, you go into it. Well, if you lose to Purdue, you're done anyway.
You should be.
But you should be, unless you're in the SEC, and then that loss does not count. Um,
Well,
but you
ain't
go.
nobody in the SEC as bad as Purdue is.
Auburn's pretty bad. There are a couple bad teams. But yeah, nobody's as bad as Purdue. But you go into championship week, and this is where it kind of gets dicey. Too, do you knock out an SEC team who loses in the SEC title game, kind of like Georgia did last year? But you
That
might
could be
have,
then a three loss.
yes,
SEC team.
you could have a pair of two-loss SEC teams playing in the SEC championship game.
Yeah.
Um, going
Unlikely, but it's very possible that there is at least one
well.
two-loss SEC team.
Tennessee could lose this week.
Yep.
And they still have to play Giant Slayer Vanderbilt in there as well, who was not good enough to be in the top 25 before in the first playoff rankings.
And then
But
Texas could lose at Texas A&M,
yeah,
which would then have everybody with two
it,
losses.
with two losses, which I think is, and I've said this on podcasts before, you're going to make the playoff committee make a decision that they don't want to make, and you're looking at least right now there are one, two, three, four, five two-loss SEC teams. So you're looking at what is it, seven two-loss SEC teams. At
Right.
some point, this whole they beat up on each other stuff is just garbage.
And
The
it
Big Ten
would
beats
be
each other.
accurate that they
Yeah,
beat each other up, but it would be that's because they're all just pretty good and nobody's really good.
correct.
That's what it would be. You know,
Yeah,
parity, mediocrity, whatever term you wanted to use.
but that's not how the committee sees the SEC. It
Oh,
seems it
right,
seems like
right, right,
everybody's
right.
awesome,
Yeah,
and awesome teams are going to beat other awesome teams. So those losses to those awesome teams don't count.
yeah,
So
yeah. I think that if from an Indiana fan perspective, what is it that you're rooting for over the next few weeks? You are rooting for
rooting for an Indiana win
SEC
at Ohio
teams.
State.
Well, sure. That's the most clear-cut, clean one. It's awesome. I mean, how much fun would that be to win at Ohio State, move to 11-0, jump into the top two? I mean, to be up to second, right?
Yeah. Well, I don't. It's a better win than Oregon.
It is, but
You
I
went
don't. If
into the
Oregon,
shoe to beat Oregon. I
yeah,
mean,
if Oregon doesn't lose, I don't, just based on how voters typically operate.
oh no, I agree. But if
Yeah.
you actually watch the games,
Oh,
Oregon probably should have lost to Ohio State, and you're going into the horseshoe and you beat them to go to 11-0.
yeah.
IU should be the number one team in the country,
And
but that's
obviously
not.
it would move you into, the Big Ten championship game. Um,
Yes, which then goes to, would you rather go 11-1 and have the bye week
right.
during championship week, or I mean, look, you'd rather win and get the Big Ten title, of course,
Yeah.
but are you better off taking that bye week or playing in the championship game, losing, and then playing, what is it, a week or so later?
Yeah.
But that's a bridge we'll cross later.
Right. Right. The paths that you want to see cleared would involve SEC teams picking up a third loss
Yep.
because
So that means
that
you're rooting for Tennessee this weekend.
that gives you margin for error and not for you to lose to Purdue. That's not the error I'm talking about, but margin for some shade coming from the selection committee, some doubt coming from the selection committee. If you're 11-1, if there's two-loss SEC teams and a bunch of those, who knows what can happen? If there's a bunch of three-loss SEC teams, well, you're not going to get hurt by that.
Hold on. Alabama is playing a 9-win Mercer team this year that they're sure to get credit for. They're a 9-1 Mercer team.
That'll end
what
up with 10 wins.
that'll end up with 10 or 11 wins. What conference? The Southern Conference, first place Southern Conference.
Yeah,
You know, a potential conference champion win there. That's the strength of schedule that we're talking about. But you're looking at um, you hope Virginia picks off Notre Dame. LSU's out.
or
Um,
or Army.
yeah, or Army. That would be interesting. And then if you really want chaos, Oregon goes to Madison this weekend.
Yeah,
like then so Oregon gets a loss, and then all hell breaks loose in the Big Ten because you're
Sure,
potentially back into the tiebreaker situation, kind of what you had with if Penn State had beaten Ohio State,
yeah,
um, and you go down whatever however many steps it is to for them not to pick IU. Yeah, you're rooting for Tennessee at Georgia, um, and that's about it. And maybe Kansas knocks off BYU, but
right, right. Um, yeah, I think the ACC is likely now a one bid league. I think, given Miami's loss and based on where SMU is in the rankings, I don't think they can handle a second loss and still get in. Um, and I don't think Miami could either. So I think the ACC is now a one bid league.
yeah,
The Big 12, what happens if BYU goes 12 and 0, loses in the Big 12 title game to Colorado? Um, Obviously, Colorado gets in, gets to bye. Does a 12 and 1 BYU with their only defeat being in the conference title game, do they get in? Probably. Because you cannot have, if you're college football, you cannot have these conference title games being detrimental to teams' playoff chances,
right.
and
I
their
mean,
their
it's
resumes. You
still
can't, or
they'll
it becomes something that the conferences try to get rid of, and it
yeah
makes
they'll
money,
make up
so they
the
won't do it.
well they'll figure out how to find you got to figure out the money there because maybe getting two
Yes,
teams in makes up for not having a conference title game or something like that.
sure, sure.
Um,
So you
but
BYU, you want to have lose. You're right about that. Um, you know, I think that Ole Miss, they're 8-2. Yeah, they've got the bad loss to Kentucky, but uh, boy, that's a good team. They're they're really good, um, and I think that dominant win over Georgia, I think probably gets a 10-2 Ole Miss in, but I think that a three-loss Georgia would not get in ahead of Indiana. A three-loss Georgia would not. A three-loss Texas A&M, certainly not. A three-loss Alabama, if they dropped again, no. Um, a two-loss Texas would not
depends
be
if they could
seated would not be seated ahead of Indiana, I don't think.
no unless they win
So
the SEC title and which they could at two losses.
yeah,
Um,
I think that's the biggest thing you're rooting for is just these two-loss SEC teams
to pick each other
to
off.
get a third loss.
Yep.
And the more of that happens, the more, for lack of a better term, I hate using this for college football, but bid thieves. Uh, the more bid thieves you have that disappear, the better
Yep.
for Indiana. So that's in general what you're rooting for, is the teams that are around you that could grab a bid from you to take a third loss.
Yeah, and we see the excuse for IU's locked and loaded with strength of schedule, and that's going to
Sure.
be the main barrier. But yeah, a close loss at Ohio State gives you a good loss, and that seems to have value over some wins. And then you just hope maybe Virginia picks off Notre Dame, um, Virginia Army, and or USC picks off Notre
USC
Dame.
would be great because it would
US
be another, they would have two good non-conference wins and then struggle in the Big Ten, which would logically leave you saying, oh, well, maybe those middle Big Ten teams that everybody bags on is maybe they're okay, you know?
yeah,
Yeah, that would be great. And it would leave Notre Dame with two losses that are both worse than what Indiana would have.
yeah, and I would assume Notre Dame would be out.
Boy, you would assume.
but I assume.
Yes.
So we'll
Yes.
see. It all comes out tonight around 8:30. Hopefully around 8:30. There's
Yep.
no stupid targeting calls or delays in these MAC games. At halftime on ESPN, we'll have all the reaction to it as well. Final thoughts, TJ?
What a great time for a bye week. Uh, really, really good time for a bye week after a physical game, emotionally taxing game against Michigan. You've got some guys that you hope to rest up and get healed up and figure out, with some more time to prepare, figure out what you can do on the offensive line. Because, Ohio State is not going to blitz as much as Michigan did. That's just not the way Jim Knowles operates, but they'll certainly look at Michigan's second half defense and figure out, okay, what caused issues and what can we do with better personnel um, that maybe not on the defensive line. It's not that Ohio State has a bad defensive line, but they don't have the two remarkable defensive tackles that Michigan does. But what can we do to mimic what gave Indiana trouble? Um, and IU's coaches get 2 weeks to counter whatever that's going to be and get 2 weeks to get guys healed and rested up for these last 2 weeks of the regular season. So perfectly timed second bye week for them and for IU fans to get ready for something that we're just not used to, a massive, massive game with national implications uh, in the middle of November.
Yeah, one might even say at the end of November.
You might, you could.
It
Yep.
is the back half of November, but yeah, as we said when the schedule came out, the bye week between the Michigan and Ohio State games is great. It lets you kind of recover from a team that laid the lumber in Michigan and gives you a week to digest the win, get over it, and then get back to practice and get some guys healthy. You'd hope to see Miles Price back. We won't get an update
No.
probably until Saturday of Ohio State. And then maybe Justice Ellison gets healthy as well. And you could go into that game, even though you lost Drew Evans, as healthy as you've been all year outside of the Michigan State game. But yeah, playoff rankings come out tonight, and then IU fans can sit back, relax, and watch these teams hopefully cannibalize themselves um, during the week on Saturday. So that does it for the Hoosier Huddle podcast today. You can follow us on Twitter at Hoosier_Huddle and keep coming back to HoosierHuddle.com. Also, it is in for Indiana Day. So if you're feeling generous with your pocketbook, head over to In for Indiana and Hoosiers Connect. They're doing their NIL drive this week. So that does it for the Hoosier Huddle podcast. Again, we apologize for not being on last week, but we'll have all the news and notes heading into Ohio State week, which should be a top five matchup um, on Saturday. And it's at noon on Fox, and Ohio State fans are already whining that they play too many noon games.
Well, I don't know. Maybe we can help give them one less meaningful home game to worry about.